Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, racial exploitation in college sports, a continuing disgrace. Our moderator is Bruce Smith, President and CEO, Academic Consulting and Empowerment Strategies.
Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Drake Group, thanks to all of you attending for joining us. The Drake Group is an academic think tank working to better educate Congress, higher education leaders, and athletics administrators about critical issues in intercollegiate athletics. In 2021, Drake issued a comprehensive report detailing the myriad of ways in which intercollegiate athletics has turned a blind eye to the racism underlying the economic, education, and other forms of exploitation harming college athletes. Black and brown college athletes are used for their talent, denied opportunities to excel in the classroom, excluded from administrative leadership and coaching positions in college sport, and are often have their voices silenced. The purpose of this webinar is to suggest solutions. How do we keep everything good about athletics while removing these harms? You have received the biographies of our panelists, but I'd like to briefly recognize and thank them for being here. First is JEREMI DURU, Professor of Law at American University and one of my college classmates, one of our nation's foremost sports law authorities. We also have with us today Kaia Mccullough, activist and former professional soccer player, former Pac-12 Scholar Athlete of the Year, and one of the first college athletes to kneel during the national anthem to express the seriousness of these racial concerns. We also have here today my Drake Group colleague, EMMETT GILL, Chief Visionary Officer for Athletes and Advocates for Social Justice in Sports, founder of Athlete Talk, a licensed mental health professional and fellow member of the Drake Board of Directors. Also, I want to emphasize that the panelists are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or are members, unless they make that distinction in the remarks. So I think we're ready to begin. I'll start with this. I'm a child of 80s Washington, DC, and I grew up a fan of Georgetown basketball. My friend Emmett has a picture of John Thompson and his book right behind him, a book that I'm currently reading. The Hoyas coach was a heroic figure amongst my friends and family, not only because of his success on the basketball court, but because of his fierce support of his players' right to a full collegiate experience, access to the full academic program, and to be seen as full human beings, all things that we're going to touch on today. Coach Thompson represents a lot of things, one of them being a representative of college athletics, a person with real power, who used that power to support academic opportunities and personhood for Black college athletes, not just his own, but athletes on other teams and other programs and at other institutions. Athletes who otherwise are exploited by the very system that purports to offer them the world. In a recent paper detailing the exploitation of athletes of college and college sports, the Drake Group states the following. The Drake Group believes that the commercialization of intercollegiate athletic programs has not only challenged the academic integrity of higher education, but resulted in a predominantly white community of higher education administrators, athletic department administrators, coaches, and staff turning a blind eye to the racism underlying the economic, education, and other forms of exploitation harming college athletes. The in-depth review of current athletic program practices and National Conference Governance Association rules and policies reveals the manner in which racism experienced by all stakeholders within this culture, how it is purposely hidden, and how it harms athletes and employees of color. And what we're going to do today is dive into those two sentences, what exactly they mean for athletes, how it gets played out, and how that exploitation as it gets played out harms Black and brown athletes especially. That paper also laid out a set of recommendations. And I think I'm in a position today to read a couple of handfuls of them off to you today, because these recommendations will provide a framework for our discussion today. Among the recommendations are a few opportunities that will be addressed during our time today, ranging from academic opportunities physical and mental health concerns, and legal issues. They include, one, a call for the NCAA to commission an independent comprehensive investigation of athletic program racism. Two, initiation of aggressive programs to recruit young minority athletes to participate in low minority participation sports. Three, an adoption of institutional hiring policies that maximize the number of minority candidates in applicant and finalist pools. This is for coaching and administrative positions. Four, confrontation of internal athletic department racial microaggressions and education of all stakeholders of diversity commitment. Five, academic disclosure and peer review of educational outcomes by race and ethnicity. Six, an adoption of a trauma-informed mental health care strategy for athletes of color, including first-year screening and mental health education and mandatory employee mental health education and reporting. Seven, establishment of conference diversity, equity, inclusion task forces to address racism and prejudice behavior. Number eight, governance organization adoption of coach conduct standards, complaint procedures and investigation, adjudication and disciplinary processes to protect college athletes from abusive, racist, and other behaviors that cause mental and physical harm. Number nine, the NCAA leadership to increase diversity of athletics mental health practitioners. 10 is a call for institutions to fully support the rights of all athletes to freely express their concerns about racism. 11, a call for athletic departments to proactively identify, expose, and retire vestiges of racism and intentionally support the history and cultural identity of college athletes of color. And lastly, for today, number 12, the call for Congress to immediately act to guarantee full college athlete NIL rights, enact health and medical protection, and address the need for more comprehensive intercollegiate athletics reform to address issues of racism and educational exploitation. In my past life as an academic support professional in Division I athletics, I told myself that I could transform the system from inside the system. This is a thing that we often hear. And I got into that work for at least a couple of reasons. First, I knew that there were some number of Black athletes, especially in basketball and football, who were less prepared to compete in the classroom than they were in the field and less prepared to compete than their peers. I also knew that I could help them. As an educator, I was devoted and committed to supporting all students from marginalized backgrounds. So, so many of the academic professionals out there working in college sports believe in that piece very strongly. I also thought that the system needed changing. And I thought that I could, well, not on my own, contribute to that change. I quickly learned that there was a bunch of difficulties, a bunch of barriers and ladders thrown in the way, hurdles thrown in the way of that goal. I learned that what I call the yes coach mentality, which is an overriding chase for revenue, and that overriding chase for revenue will not allow the system to change. I quickly learned that it was best to be clear with coaches and administrators I work most closely with, that our aims and goals were at odds. My quest to transform a system in ways that allowed athletes, and especially athletes of color, to succeed in the classroom and beyond the field of sport, kept running into the main priorities of those coaches and administrators, which were winning and making dollars. A few things that I learned during my time in that world, I think can help to inform our discussion today. One, the yes coach mentality is pervasive. Everywhere you turn, coaches will ask or demand, and people will say yes coach, no matter what they feel. Two, many in college athletics departments believe that the less involved athletes are on campus and beyond the field of play, the better it is for the team and for the department. Three, Black athletes and other athletes of color, especially in revenue sports, are both ignored and silenced. Their academic well-being and needs go overlooked, and they're often prevented from speaking up about the very exploitation that they experience. And fourthly, athletics departments and institutions lack the political will to transform college athletics, and this exploitation just continues and goes on and on. The exploitation of Black and other athletes of color begins with an underrepresentation of people of color in decision-making roles. The people who make decisions about the lives and experiences of college athletes and who have access to the greatest amount of revenue are overwhelmingly white, and that includes coaches and administrators. At the same time, the college athletes who overwhelmingly perform the labor that creates that revenue are overwhelmingly Black. That yes coach mentality allows these mostly white coaches and administrators to enact policies and practices that benefit them while harming athletes, and to do so without substantial or meaningful critique. As we've seen recently, revelations about former coach Urban Meyer's tenure at Ohio State made by a former player, and the immediate and really, really swift backlash that player felt fully demonstrate the power of yes coach. As college athletics becomes more professionalized, athletes have less and less opportunity to participate in a full collegiate experience. Instead, the labor is used to provide those kind of experience to their non-athlete peers and other fans of college sports. Those folks get to engage in a bunch of fun, especially on game day and around game day, that quite frankly, the athletes don't have the time or access to participate in. With so much at stake in terms of revenue and power, athletic administrators and their bosses in the college administration have demonstrated an attachment to the outdated amateur model and a lack of will to transform college athletics into a system that works for all athletes, especially athletes of color. As I said in last month's webinar, I love college sports. There's so much about it that is good, that is even good for the athletes who are participating. As a former athlete, I can certainly attest to that. And there's a lot to keep that is really good. And at the same time, while we celebrate the good, we have to be really critical and seek to transform the bad. And I'm really happy to have a couple of friends with me today to talk about that. So now our panelists will introduce themselves and their work. They'll talk a little bit about their own specific experience working within the college sports system that exploits athletes of color. And then after they speak, each get a chance to speak, we'll get into the questions. So JEREMI, you're up next.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate being on this panel. I'm honored to be on this panel. As Bruce mentioned, we went to college together, EMMETT and I, been talking about these issues for probably a decade, formally, informally. Donna Lopiano is a hero, personal hero of mine. And so to be able to be associated with this group and this session is important to me. And Kaia, who I just met a few days ago, is so deeply impressive in what she's done and what she's planning to do. I'm kind of blown away by it. And the fact that she's going to law school, I think is fantastic. She'll be a real credit to the profession. So briefly, Jeremy Durham, a professor of law at American University, Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. And I focus on sport and society. So issues of sport and race and gender and disability, and thinking about how sport can make us better. And that's what my work's about. I was counsel for about 18 years to an organization called the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which is the organization in the National Football League of scouts and coaches and front office personnel of color. We've worked hard to try to diversify those ranks. And through that work, I've found myself involved with the attempts to diversify the ranks of coaches on the college level in football and elsewhere. And I'll get into that in a minute. Before that, I kind of wanted just to begin by engaging the premise that is our premise, that college athletics are racially exploitative. And I just want to spend a moment on it because I imagine some people in this webinar may recoil at that notion. People love college sports, as Bruce said. He loves them. I think all of us on this panel love sport. People who've been involved as an athlete, as a spectator, working sport, around sport. And often when you're engaged with a context, it's hard for you to be critical of. And so I'd encourage anyone who kind of recoils at the idea that collegiate athletics is systemically exploitative, that they resist the notion to recoil and honestly consider the possibility. In the past 2 years, much of this country has had to come to terms with the fact that there is systemic discrimination in this country and that there are frightening disparities in the criminal justice system. And I think people hold views now that they didn't hold 2 years ago, didn't really contemplate 2 years ago. So I'd ask for those who are a bit critical of the premise to at least be willing to self-challenge here and engage the conversation and think about the points that are being made that express concerns about the collegiate athletic system. Because as Bruce said, when you have a multi-billion-dollar industry that can only exist because thousands of people who produce the revenue do not get paid, it raises concerning questions. And when the disproportionate number of people who are making the money are not of color, and the disproportionate number of people who are engaged in the physical effort are of color, that raises questions. And while some people might say, well, there is the benefit of the bargain, the student athlete often, when we're talking about revenue producing sports, and particularly at the major sports schools, while these student athletes often are on scholarship and therefore getting an education in exchange for their athletic toil, I think we have to question assumptions about what the education looks like. Some student athletes receive the education they signed up for, but many are pushed away from what they signed up for, what they bargained for. I've represented student athletes in lawsuits against institutions, and I've heard story after story after story of high school athletes sitting in their living room with their parents being recruited and being told, of course we offer computer science, absolutely, and certainly you can major in mathematics. We've got great professors there. It's a great place to study biology. We've got a great medical school. And then the student athletes get onto campus and they're told, oh, those majors are really tough. And those majors have labs in the afternoon and they may pose conflicts with practice, and we really need you to be committed to this team effort. So please do keep that in mind when you select your classes. So real strong nudges away from where the student athletes wanted to be academically, or in some cases, I've had clients who are simply told, here's your schedule for the semester. And that's it. There isn't even much in the way of deciding. So the academic experience student athletes get signed up for often gets pried away from them. And on top of that, they're often funneled into courses lacking a whole lot of rigor so they can focus on the athletics. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can't be said that it's a rarity. It's real. So if we assume the education, the benefit of the bargain for the student athlete exists, let's at least poke holes into the presumption that it's always what the student athlete has bargained for. So again, we have this discussion as we move forward. I just ask people that are willing to self-challenge and challenge their own reluctance, perhaps, to see exploitation in college athletics. And if I may offer a book recommendation, it's 15 years old, but still the most fantastic book on this topic that I've read and I think exists, is a book by Bill Rhoden, New York Times columnist, $40 Million Slaves. It is a must read. So I'd encourage anybody who hasn't read that book to pick up the book and to read it. So my work, in addition to representing student athletes in disputes with the universities, has focused largely on racial discrimination in employment, and particularly with respect to coaches, mostly in the NFL with the Fritz Pollard Alliance, not entirely, but mostly in the NFL. And that NFL work has led me to college athletics, and particularly college football. And in both contexts, the pro context and the college context, this goes to one of the points that Bruce made early on, the number of head coaches of color is deeply disproportionate to the number of players of color. And the higher you go up in the power structure, the less diverse it gets, and it's quite stark. So with respect to players, a lot of players of color, particularly in the revenue producing sports. There are fewer people of color who are, let's take football just for example now, fewer people of color who are position coaches, fewer still who are coordinators, fewer still who are head coaches. You get to the GM level or the NFL level, in the NFL or the AD level in college, fewer still, you get to the president of a club or president of a university, hardly any. The numbers are ugly. And just focusing on coaching in the NFL with the astounding firing of Brian Flores of Miami Dolphins a couple of days ago. I don't know how many people followed that, but very, very surprising firing. With this firing, we're down to 3 coaches of color, head coaches of color out of 32 clubs. FBS, I think the number 17 or so out of 130, deeply disproportionate. So in an NFL context, we looked at these numbers, and 20 years ago, there were 3 head coaches of color in the National Football League. So there's been fluctuation. The numbers have gone way up, and now they've come back down. So we looked at the numbers back in 20 years ago when there were 3 head coaches of color in the league, and we dug deep into it. A study was commissioned from the University of Pennsylvania to figure out what's going on, why the numbers are so low, how are the head coaches who've actually gotten the opportunities producing. And so a study was done going 15 years back, from 2001 back to 1986. And an assessment was made comparing the win-loss records of Black head coaches and of white head coaches. And in the first year with the club, Black head coaches won almost 3 more games per season than white head coaches. And this is an NFL 16-game season. So 3 games is huge, right? In the year of termination, Black coaches won 1.5 more games than white coaches. And overall, they won more games than white coaches, went to the playoffs more often than white coaches. The conclusion was not that Black coaches are inherently better coaches than white coaches. The conclusion was that these Black coaches were made to apprentice for so long under so many head coaches as they were denied opportunities that they just became better. They had more expertise, they had more experience, and they just became better. So we saw the same sort of thing going on in college athletics. We don't have that same 15-year study, but we saw the same sort of thing going on anecdotally. In the National Football League, the rule that was instituted to try and combat this dynamic is something called the Rooney Rule. And the Rooney Rule demands that you interview at least 1 person of color for a head coach opening. It's now been expanded to general managers and also coordinators, but at the time it was for a head coach opening. And once that rule was implemented, and we can talk later in question and answer about how strong the rule is, if it makes sense. I believe the rule makes sense. The concept is you get someone in the door who wouldn't have gotten in the door otherwise. I believe that poor implementation and poor enforcement ultimately flout the power of the rule. But I think the rule, the concept behind it makes sense. And so that rule was implemented in the National Football League, and the numbers started to go up. When the leadership that supported the rule, an owner internally passed away, and the external watchdog retired, the numbers started to go down. The league didn't implement it in the same or enforce it in the same way. But anyway, initially the Rooney Rule seemed to be effective. And we actually made a push to get it adopted on the collegiate level. I was a part of meetings with 2 different NCAA administrations in Indianapolis, 3 or 4 different heads of DE&I over the course of, I don't know, more about 13 years. And there wasn't any real traction, no real progress. It was resisted on many grounds. It was said that because the NCAA is a membership organization, the NCAA couldn't create any mandate. There was an argument that because some schools are public and some are private, there's a constitutional concern perhaps with this sort of rule. I actually question both of those premises, some we can talk about later as well. I think the NCAA wasn't feeling like it was prepared to go out and push its member institutions to do something to change this really unfortunate dynamic. What did happen is that the Division I Athletic Directors Association, led by someone named Dutch Bowman at the time, no longer there, said, you know what, the NCAA is not going to implement it, but I'm going to implement it with all my ADs. I'm going to tell them they should interview a person of color. And I'm going to hold them to it. And when Bowman did that, the numbers started to go up. Bowman stepped down, and the numbers have kind of stagnated over the course of the past several years. I should point out that the NCAA does have some mentorship programs in place and developmental programs for young aspiring coaches. They put together something called the President's Pledge, where presidents would individually pledge to interview a person of color for these positions. There's been marginal progress, but not great progress. The West Coast Conference has now implemented its own Rooney Rule. Since the NCAA didn't do it, the West Coast Conference has done it. Just did it a couple of years ago. We'll see what sort of progress that produces. But the bottom line, and I'll pass the mic in a moment, is that progress has been painfully slow. It's hard to figure out how to create true change and true equal opportunity for people of color off of the playing field, off of the courts, off of the track, out of the gyms. I'm a litigator, and one of the big concerns and issues is that litigation isn't going to solve the problem. Courts are very, in my view, courts are, unless you have a smoking gun evidence, because courts are very deferential to defendants. When a defendant says, hey, I just thought this person was right for the job. This person just had the temperament I wanted. They had the leadership style I wanted. Courts are very reluctant to go behind a defendant that says that, particularly in sports. And the courts feel like they don't know anything about sports, so they don't want to get involved there. And so the civil rights community in sport is trying to figure out how to create this opportunity without civil litigation as a stick. And it's difficult right now. It's frustrating. We've got to find ways to systematize equal opportunity in coaching and administrative roles in collegiate athletics, because right now they just don't exist. So I look forward to talking more about this and whatever else folks want to talk about, in the question answer period. I pass it back to Bruce to introduce another panelist.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate all of that you shared just now. We will speak a little bit more in the Q&A, both about Bill Rhoden's book and maybe a little bit more about the NCAA and the Rooney Rule and how that might look for college athletes. Next up is Kaia Mccullough.
Hey there, thanks for the introduction. Hello to everybody here. I'm just super grateful to be a part of such a wonderful and powerful discussion and be in the same virtual room as such great thinkers and educators and change makers. It's a little overwhelming being at the ripe young age of 23, but I know that there's a lot of work to be done and I'm excited to be doing it. A little bit about my background. I was a UCLA soccer athlete from 2016 to 2019, graduated with a degree in political science. After my time at UCLA, I was drafted into the NWSL, which is the top tier pro women's soccer league in America right now. I played in 2020 for the Washington Spirit, and I actually ended up retiring from soccer at the end of 2020 for experiencing abuse at the hands of my coach, which is a whole other topic that you could get into in women's sports especially. But now I am currently a project manager for a nonprofit called Common Goal, doing social justice work in the soccer space. I am running their anti-racist project, and I am the chairwoman of another nonprofit called Anti-Racist Soccer Club, which is also looking to do some of the same work. So I really, my experience in the college athlete space has really informed my activism up to this point. And I think my understanding of a lot of the issues that we're talking about in this webinar today have been through my own experience, and not necessarily, I didn't realize these things when I was going through the process of being a student athlete. It was more so upon my own reflection about my experience and what myself and my teammates and my peers had been experiencing working within the NCAA system. So, not only did my activism, I would argue, really start in college, but it fueled the activism that I am still practicing today. I was one of the first college athletes to kneel in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick in protest of police brutality, but then also, it sort of evolved into protesting racial injustice in all of its forms. That was in 2017. I was a sophomore, I was 19 years old, and I was sick and tired of seeing the world around me burn and, seeing my community be exploited. I am a young biracial Black woman, and I, have experienced racism in all of its forms. And to know that, soccer, which was supposed to be a safe space for me, was not that, as a Black woman, was really sort of the fuel in my belly to get me to start protesting these things. My experience in activism while I was in college is a unique one because, quite frankly, I think it's actively discouraged in the current college sports space. While I was at UCLA, I had the support of not only my teammates, but also my coaches, my head coach, assistant coaches, and also the administrators at my school, which I can recognize now as a very unique experience. I think in a lot of ways, activism is very discouraged. And, whether that's directly saying, you can't do this, or indirectly, I have a friend who was actually cut from his football program at Washington State University for joining a movement and protecting himself from COVID-19 when that whole pandemic started. So I think there are both indirect ways in which this sort of activism is discouraged. And I can recognize my privilege in, being able to express my beliefs, especially surrounding racial justice, being in LA, being at UCLA specifically, which has a long history of Black activists, athletes, Jackie Robinson, Arthur Ashe, the list goes on and on. So I don't think that it is, I don't think that it is a surprise that I was one of the only college athletes at the time that was able to use my platform and use my voice in the college athletic space in this way. I think a part of this larger problem of the exploitation of athletes of color really points to the fact that athletes aren't necessarily educated on the fact that they're even being exploited. I think a lot of this exploitation happens very insidiously, for lack of a better word. I think it's done in, the meetings that you have as an athlete, fear mongering you about, NCAA rules and eligibility requirements, and threatening, your ability to have an education and threatening your ability to have somewhere to live. I think in a lot of ways, athletics are a way for athletes of color to, move up in the world. And I think having a system that gives them no power and gives them no ability to have a say in what they're doing really creates this dynamic that exasperates racial hierarchies in a way that not a lot of people realize. I don't think that looking back, I don't think I really had a lot of support as a Black woman specifically in the college athletic space, in terms of mental health support, in terms of, trauma-informed mental health help. In my activism, there was instances where, TMZ would write about what I was doing and what my team was doing, and I would have people like comment very, very, very racially or not racially sensitive, racist comments on social media. And in southern states like Florida State, it would be hard kneeling in person. So I think that I didn't have the amount of support that athletes of color deserve. And this is a modern thing. Again, I graduated in 2019. I think it's worth recognizing that this isn't just a theoretical concept that we are talking about. There's data to back it up. There is experiential data to back it up. I lived through this. And I think another big point in, when we're talking about the racial exploitation of athletes of color in this space is sports are put before school. And I think it really limits the ability of athletes of color to get the education that is promised to them. I myself, even though I graduated with a political science degree, I was forced to change my concentration from race, ethnicity, and politics, which is obviously the space that I work in now, to American politics, because schedule-wise, it didn't work for me. I also started off as a STEM major, and like was mentioned before, it was very, very, very difficult to schedule classes for it, even in having coaches that were very flexible with me and who understood my passions. So I think that points to, even the fact that I had an experience where my coaches were supportive the larger structure of college athletics disables people from being able to have true control over their futures. And I think it's debilitating. Not only that, I think it was really difficult for me as I'm going through the law school process now and, getting letters of recommendation. I was unable to really make good connections with my professors during my college experience, during my undergrad, because I simply didn't have time to go to office hours. Office hours were often scheduled during practices or games. And I think in a lot of instances, I had pretty contentious relationships with professors who didn't like me missing as much as I was. And it was year round. It wasn't just during our season. You practice year round as an athlete, and it makes it difficult to take the classes that you want and to cultivate meaningful relationships that you can then use to propel you into the future and into your career post whatever game you play. It took a while for me to separate my identity as a person and as a soccer player, and I'm still kind of actively in that position now. I'm still working through that process, but I think a lot of that started in the college athletic space because I wasn't able to create connections and an identity outside of my sport for my entire time. That's 4 years of doing 40-hour weeks, which it's a full-time job. And so you become really consumed in, this identity as a college athlete. And I think that's part of the systemic issue, is that we are creating a culture that makes college athletes feel like their only value is in being an athlete. And it's hard to break out of that, which I think is a part of, again, the problem. We're creating this uneducated labor force that doesn't realize that they're being exploited and that they're being stifled. They just have to shut up and dribble and put their heads down and get through their experience as a laborer and make money for these institutions, while they're also not being able to develop fully as people. I think there's been good starts with NIL. I wish that I had NIL while I was there. Unfortunately, it came after I was a college athlete, but even just thinking about how that could have impacted me, I was broke as an athlete. I was broke. I was on half scholarship. The rest was, state aid. I didn't have too much money to, have a good diet and really cultivate myself as a person off the field. And so I think that there are a lot of issues that we're going to be discussing today that really need to be systemically changed. It's not just on the individual to make this change. It's on the administrators, it's on the structures, it's on the NCAA as a whole to make these changes. And I'm just excited to be a part of the solution, hopefully. And with that, I will pass it back to Bruce.
Thank you so much, Kaia. There are a couple of things that I think we'll want to get into a little later, especially around your feeling that UCLA does a good job or did a good job with you. I really want to learn more about that. And this idea about being consumed by the athlete identity. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that as well. And next up for us is my good friend, EMMETT GILL.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. I appreciate it. Hope everybody can hear me. My volume's okay. But my name's EMMETT GILL, and I am the Executive Director of Athletes and Advocates for Social Justice in Sports, a nonprofit organization that was developed in the aftermath of George Floyd and all of the initiatives that were developed post George Floyd. And I'm also the founder of Athlete Talk, which is a mental health app that is specifically designed for athletes at all different levels. We're one of only 2 such apps in the field. And I also serve as an assistant professor at George Mason University here in Falls Church, Virginia. And I'm really just excited to be here with what I call doers, right? Kaia, JEREMI, Bruce have all been sort of down in the weeds, dealing with the devil in the details. And so it's really exciting to speak with folks who can speak from a theoretical perspective as well as a practical perspective. And like Kaia, explained through lived experience. Is this topic is challenging for me, and I think it's for the very reason that JEREMI mentioned. When we talk about race, it can be uncomfortable, right? But as many people say in the field of motivation, if you want something different, then you have to do something different, and oftentimes that includes being uncomfortable. And for me, I was a student athlete way back 30 years ago, competing in the sport of baseball, where I was one of 3 minorities who played alongside of 39 other players who were not Black and brown. And so I had sort of a firsthand experience, especially when you talk about competing in baseball. And we look at the numbers in Major League Baseball, and we look at the numbers in college baseball and how they are skewed and how few Blacks participate. I had some firsthand experiences with what we now call microaggressions, micro insults, and micro assaults. And so I think it was probably after my time at the University of Texas, where I served as the Director of Student Athlete Wellness and Personal Development, that I really decided that I wanted to do more specifically with athletes and focusing on Black and brown athletes. For the most part, my work has been in the mental health space in college athletics at several universities, including Rutgers and North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. And so most of my work was global. But then I decided to drill down and specifically work with Black and brown athletes. And I think it was important to me simply because when we talk about race, so often we don't listen to the narrative, as Kaia explained, around the impact. One of the things that we'll talk about today is trauma. And again, Kaia mentioned trauma-informed care. But when you experience micro assaults or you experience micro insults, and it might be, and I've heard from, say, Black female athletes who compete in the sport of tennis, how their teammates might want to touch their hair because their hair looks different, or they decide that they want to mock a dance, that's popular, in Black communities. Those things have an effect. And we have this thing called complex trauma, where, repeated experiences over time have an impact on our athletes. And I think what you hear in the background there is you may hear our 16-pound guard dog. So excuse me for that. So I really wanted to drill down and be able to focus on the impact of racism on college athletes. But as we well know, there's so many different systems that we have to deal with. Not only do we have to deal with the level of administrators, where we see is predominantly white, but then we also have to look at coaching, which is also predominantly white. When we look at college administrators, the same case. But then let's also expand it to the fan base. Let's also expand it to the conference level. And so when we're talking about all these stakeholders and the different levels that college athletes have to deal with, and then we look at the impact, it's hard to dispute, the fact that there is some exploitation in college athletics. If you recall, some years ago, Marcus Smart from Oklahoma State, from the Oklahoma State University basketball team, decided to go into the stands because he alleged that a fan made a racist comment. I can also remember a time as a faculty mentor for the Rutgers women's basketball team when we made a trip to one of our conference foes, and I was sitting behind the women's basketball team, who a year earlier had been referred to as nappy-headed hoes by Don Imus. And I did not have to turn around. I did not want to turn around because I heard all the fans shouting these racist, sexist comments at these 18 to 21-year-olds. I know that it had an impact on them then, and I suspect that it's still having a long-lasting impact on them. Because when student athletes and athletes in general experience these traumatic experiences, they're not something that disappears after the experience has concluded. And so what I hope that we're able to do is not only explore the different levels and how it might be exploitative or racist on those levels, but also begin to, document and keep a mental note of how many things are going on and how they impact athletes. And then the last thing that I'll say is that not only do we have that, but if we look at the situation in the state of Missouri in the aftermath of the 2015 boycott by the Missouri football team, and the reality that legislators introduced legislation that said that if athletes engage in these types of activism, that they could risk losing their scholarship. Not only do you have the racist instances and experiences and systems, but then when athletes and others try and push back, it's as if, they're doing something wrong. And when I was listening to Kaia, I was listening to the changes in the tone of her voice. I got the sense that even talking about some of this was having an emotional impact on me. And so going back to what JEREMI said, if we do have some instances where we want to push back today, here's a prime example of evidence that racism is not just something that happens, but it's something that happens and then it has an effect on the well-being of those who experience the racism. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Again, thank you for joining us. And I'm really excited to hear about what my colleagues are going to say as we kick it back to Bruce.
All right. Thank you so much, Emmett. I think I'll ask you a question a little bit later about some of these recommendations from the Drake group and what you would suggest as priorities. I'm going to ask JEREMI first to talk a little bit about that Bill Rhoden book. Maybe share the name of that book again. We've had a question in the chat looking for a reference, and I would love to have more than a reference. That book was vital to my development as an educational professional. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how that book impacted you and your thinking about hiring with coaches and with administrators.
Sure, Bruce. Yeah, so the book is called $40 Million Slaves, $14 Million Slaves, and it's by Bill Rhoden, William Rhoden. And again, I recommend it highly. So the book, basically, the core of the book is that Rhoden talks about what he calls a conveyor belt. It's a fascinating book. If you haven't read it and you're interested in the space, then until you read it, I think that you're doing yourself a disservice. He talks about the conveyor belt, this assembly line almost that so many Black kids are placed on, perhaps placing themselves on it because they believe that's what is expected of them from society, or perhaps society is thrusting them onto it. But the space where they are deemed to be able to have success when maybe their ability to have success in other spaces, non-athletic spaces, is questioned. And so they gravitate to it and they end up being commoditized as they move through middle school, where you start to get recruited by universities if you're an outstanding athlete, into high school, and then up to college, and then to the professional ranks, all the while being appreciated and respected for your athleticism, often at the expense of other things. And then in the upper stages of that trajectory, on the college level and on the professional level, this formerly young child who's now grown up through the system finds that their options ultimately are limited. They may be a professional athlete and they get drafted by a certain club because there's a collective bargaining agreement between the Players Association and the league that says that we're going to allow a draft. And the draft says, if you get drafted by Sacramento, that's where you're playing. If you get drafted by Green Bay, that's where you're playing, and you don't have an option in it. And that concern exists today. It was even worse years ago. Free agency has evolved some, but still there are restrictions. Then he talks about the restrictions collegiately. All the ones we've talked about today, the ones that Kaia has talked about, the ways in which you're taught as a young Black child that this is kind of the promised land, and you get there and you find you're restricted in so many ways and placed in this box that you can't develop. I love the way that Kaia put it. I think she said, cultivate myself as a full human being. So that's essentially what Roden talks about. And he also talks about, and I think this is fascinating because we're seeing it now, a slightly different point, but he talks about, for those of us who are old enough who remember Michigan's Fab Five, when they had 5 freshman basketball players who were all Black. They all decided to go to Michigan. Jalen Rose, Chris Webber, and all those folks. They decided together. They played in the AAU circuit together. They decided together, we're going to go to Michigan. And he said how extraordinary that was in terms of them displaying their power, that they were going only if they all could go. And then he said, but just imagine if they picked the HBCU. That's really displaying their power. And now 15 years later, what are we seeing? We're seeing top level 5-star recruits going to play under Deion Sanders at Jackson State. Football, we're seeing top level 5-star basketball recruits going to play at Howard a year ago. And so that's just a little aside just to show how ahead of his time I think Bill Roden was. But the book is about the way in which Black athletes, Black children, are commoditized and ultimately exploited. So that's why I think it's really a critical read for this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jeremy, and that stood out to me as well. And I'm hoping, Kaia, that you could talk a little bit more about that idea, about folks being consumed by the athlete identity and how that might play a role in how Black and brown college athletes are exploited.
Yeah, no, I actually read that book last year in my own development on trying to figure out my role in this ecosystem and, you know, again, how I could develop as a person outside of being an athlete, because my entire life, 18 years of my life, was dedicated to being a soccer player, and that's what it was. And I think, you know, the perpetuation of that idea on this conveyor belt from the time that you're a kid to the time that you go to high school. I mean, I chose my college when I was 14 years old, which is just an insane concept to think about. Like, I knew nothing about the world, and yet I was choosing where I was gonna kickstart the rest of my life at 14. And it was because of this conveyor belt. And I really do think that this idea that your value, especially for Black and brown young athletes, is like the idea that your value comes in your ability to produce on the field. Your value comes in your ability to be a laborer and to be somebody that provides entertainment for, you know, these leagues and these teams, I think is really, really, really harmful in the long run. And it really does box people in. You don't necessarily have the option to go beyond. I think the fact that I'm going to law school is quite exceptional, to be honest, because my resume, what is my resume besides being an athlete, besides being a professional athlete? I didn't have time to do internships in college. I didn't have time to do extracurriculars that were outside my sport. I didn't have time to take a job or, you know, travel abroad or experience any sort of these qualifying achievements that help in going into higher ed or that help in getting recruited into the workforce. So I think in a lot of ways, this conveyor belt pigeonholes people into this identity as an athlete. And because, you know, it's this cycle of harm, you're an athlete, you can't do anything else, so you might as well stay. It just keeps creating and keeps cycling. And I think, you know, that is the essence of like how Black and brown people are being exploited in this system. They are essentially being forced to be labor, to be capital, and they're being used as such. And I think, you know, since I've retired from my sport and since I have started on this journey towards healing and self-realization and all that fun stuff, you know, I was drafted into a league and I was told, this is where you're going. We own your rights. They literally say, we own your rights. You don't have any say in where else you're going to go. You're a rookie. I was making minimum wage. I think that this system goes beyond just college sports as well. I think, you know, I was really, really, really afraid to speak up in the same way that I was in college, where my contract was pretty much guaranteed. They couldn't, you know, cut my funding. Whereas in the pro leagues, like I was afraid of constantly having retribution for what I was saying, losing playing time, like, you know, having my contract cut, having my means of living, my health insurance, my stability in my home, my food source, my income. So I think it really is just this nasty, nasty cycle of exploitation.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of colleges recruiting 14-year-olds. I'm supposing that they were recruiting you before you were 14. That seems
Yeah.
absurd to me. And you know, you speak about the conveyor belt, and I can think about my own son. He's in the 10th grade. He's a basketball player, and as soon as he got to school, as an elementary school student, folks are identifying him as the athlete, and the impact that had not just on him, but on how his teachers interacted with him and what their expectations were of him. And we see that certainly go through from elementary school into high school, and certainly playing out for college athletes as well. Emmett, I want to ask you a question next. I'm wondering, so you were part of the group that that wrote that paper last year with the Drake group, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mental health and wellness related recommendations that paper makes.
Yeah, sure thing, Bruce. And if I could rewind really quickly and just follow up on a quick point that Jeremy and Kaia made, you know, on Jeremy's point with the Fab Five, you look at the way the Fab Five was demonized when they were doing all of these things, whether it was the black socks, whether it was the baggy pants, how they were demonized, and how, you know, with the exception of maybe Jalen Rose, how some of them like Chris Webber are still feeling the effects of what they were doing as the Fab Five. And then, you know, in terms of Kaia's experience, when we talk about this conveyor belt, I would argue, and I don't argue a lot, especially not with my wife, but I would argue that the conveyor belt that Kaia probably was put on or experienced is different than that of a football or basketball player. You know, and I think her conveyor belt, you know, is filled with landmines because she's trying to break into a sport that is predominantly white. When we talk about soccer, when we talk about the travel teams, when we talk about the culture of soccer. And then we also have to think about our black and brown males who are competing in sports like swimming, in baseball, in lacrosse. That conveyor belt is not only mentally drained, it has a certain effect on their mentality, you know, because they are identified with athletes, but they also have, you know, people who are engaging in those microaggressions, micro assaults, and micro insults. But to your question, Bruce, with regard to the recommendations, you know, I'd like to talk about a couple. The first is the reality that, you know, the NCAA and NCAA member institutions over the past, I would say, 5 years or so, have done a much better job of trying to provide mental health services for college athletes. As a matter of fact, when we look at the Power 5 conferences and those 60 some odd schools, you probably only see about 3 or 4 who don't have mental health practitioners embedded in athletics. However, the challenge is that most of these departments have only a couple of individuals. They have to service 400, 500, 600 athletes. And then when we talk about those athletes who are black and brown, given our sort of history with mental health and the way that we approach mental health, in many spaces it's questionable whether athletes are even receiving those services. I can note conversations with 2 individuals from a Power 5 conference in very large schools, very good football programs, who shared with me they have no black males and no black females on their caseload. And so we've built the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is not capable of reaching black and brown college athletes. And of course, athletes have some responsibility too with regard to their mental health. And part of the challenge is that when we look at the demography of mental health practitioners in the Power 5 conferences, almost 70% are white. And of that, the majority are white females. And I'm not trying to infer that only Black mental health practitioners can work with Black athletes, but those athletes oftentimes want to have a choice. And there is literature that says, you know, there are some people who prefer to have someone who looks like them and shares their same lived experience. And so I think in terms of the recommendations, one, more practitioners of color working in the Power 5 conferences and working in mental health in general. And the second one that I like to share is a trauma-informed care approach. Because the reality is that a number of these kids, whether they're Black females, whether they're Latina, you know, they have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And we know from the literature that if you experience 3 or more, that you might suffer from complex trauma, or the other 2 forms of trauma. But athletic departments aren't set up to do a trauma-informed care. Because as Kaia mentioned several times, you know, there were all these overriding threats. And the premise of trauma-informed care is that we need to provide a sense of safety to those individuals. And our Black athletes, some of them don't feel safe. And so we need to change the demography of mental health providers, and we also need to start exploring a trauma-informed care approach.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Emmett. And I want to follow up real quick, and then I'll have another question for Jeremy and one more for Kaia as well. You talked a little bit about microaggressions, and I'm wondering if you could talk about, help us define what that means and how trauma-informed care helps to address the impact that microaggressions have on our athletes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's sometimes it's a challenge for me to define microaggressions, but I think there are those instances where there are actions or words that are spoken that categorize that particular individual based on their race and gender, that are basically insulting, but not intended to be insulting. Okay. And so, you know, for example, again, you know, whether it's, you know, the women's tennis player who has a teammate who wants to fill their hair, or, you know, it's a member of your sports team who participates in a fraternity, and that fraternity dressed up all in blackface. You know, well, that might be a little bit more overt. But you have these instances where, you know, people are continuously making these comments or engaging in these actions that are based on a stereotype and make that individual feel uncomfortable. And that lack of comfort, again, goes back when we talk about trauma-informed care to a lack of safety. I mean, when we talk about the essence of sports, when we talk about the essence of team, you want to trust your teammates. You know, you want to have relationships with your teammates. But if you don't have a sense of safety when you're around your teammates, if your teammates are, you know, if they have this stereotypical view of you, then not only is that impacting your identity, but it's also impacting you in terms of your cohesiveness with that team, in terms of your sport performance. And so, you know, we're increasingly talking about microaggressions, insults, and assaults. But then there's also this idea of new racism. And we can talk a little bit about that later, but I hope I addressed your question.
Absolutely, thank you, Emmett. Jeremy, I'm fascinated by this idea that the NCAA resisted discussions about the Rooney Rule. And with the Drake Group recommending the NCAA conferences and their member institutions instituting some kind of hiring practices or policies that will encourage hiring of people of color, both at the level of coaches as well as with administrators. I'm wondering if we're resisting the Rooney Rule, then what are our options? What else is available out there?
Let me unmute, sorry. Yeah, so I want to draw one distinction with what you said initially, which was the NCAA resisting discussions. And here's what was kind of the maddening part about it. They haven't resisted discussions. We've had a lot of discussions. We've been talking and talking for a long time. They've resisted action. And maybe that's even worse because the discussions are there. So it appears as though there's progress, but in the end, there hasn't been the action, which has been so frustrating. Bruce, it's hard to say. I mean, they're also, the NCAA has some programs, mentorship, developmental programs, and those are important. Under US law, there's no way to mandate a certain hire, so you can't do that. So what sort of process, what sort of system do you set up that might produce a decision node at which a decision maker truly considers somebody who they wouldn't have otherwise? And that's the concept behind the Rooney Rule. So when you say what else is there, I mean, that's something we all have to put our heads together and sort through. But I would say if the NCAA is going to reject the Rooney Rule, then they should have something there. When the NFL's outside counsel, a great lawyer out of DC named Tom Williamson, was making the pitch to all the owners to adopt the Rooney Rule after the outside lawyers had pressured them, and Williamson says, yeah, we should consider this. He's at a meeting with all the 32 owners, and he proposes the idea, and everybody says, oh, well, this is a bad idea because this could happen and that could happen, and it's an okay idea, but there's this slight problem with it. And finally, he stops the meeting and he says, all right, well, what better idea do you have? And nobody had a better idea. So my view is, if you don't have a better idea and you realize that you have a problem, then implement the ideas that are being proposed and see where you can go with them. So that's what I'd say to that, Bruce. And if I can make one comment that isn't directly responsive to that question, I'll say one thing that, and I may be, people think maybe I'm a little bit out into left field on this one, but institutions don't last always, and empires fall. And I think it's critical for the NCAA to recognize that there's no guarantee that their institution and organizational structure is going to exist in 50 years or 100 years or 20 years, particularly when we're at inflection points. Right now, we've talked about two basic things. One is economic exploitation, and the other is student athletes of color not feeling entirely embraced or supported. And what we're seeing now, in my view, are early cracks, the beginnings of student athletes choosing other paths. With respect to the economic exploitation question, you have people who are going to, there's this overtime elite league that now exists, professional collegiate league, where you can play instead of going to college. You've got folks going overseas, you've got the G League. There's some football leagues that are similar, although not quite as well known. And so people are choosing other paths. And then on the racial embrace side, as I mentioned, you have people who who could be going to any university in the country to play football, and they're choosing a HBCU because they feel like they'll be embraced there. Okay, choosing Howard University, Jackson State, and other places. So what I would say is, I think the NCAA is more fragile maybe than it sees. And if it wants to continue as a preeminent entity in collegiate athletics, it has to engage these questions.
I think that's absolutely right, Jeremy. Institutions, I think we all know this, institutions will resist change until their hands get forced. And I think what you're talking about right now with athletes having a bunch of different opportunities is one of the ways that the NCAA needs to be able to see that their hand is going to be forced. If not now, then pretty soon. I think also a part of that is athlete activism. And there are a couple questions I'm thinking about, Kaia, as we related to that thing. One is I was interested to hear in your discussion that the folks at UCLA were supportive of you. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that support looked and felt like, and where you think that support was born from. Let's start with that.
Yeah, so in my decision to start kneeling, I've described this a lot of times if anybody has listened to my story before, but I kind of was really overwhelmed my sophomore year in 2017. Like, it was this overwhelming desire to start kneeling. It was like some sort of switch kind of flipped in my head. And I called my mom and I was like, I'm going to go kneel. I'm going to do it. Don't care what the consequences are. I called my dad, same thing, told him the same thing as my mom. And then the third text that I sent was to my coach. And I was like, hey, I have something to talk about. It's regarding kneeling and everything happening with Colin Kaepernick. Like, can we meet and can we discuss? And so the next day she was like, yes, after practice, my head coach, she was like, we can meet after practice. We'll have a discussion. And literally I met with my head coach and my assistant coach, Amanda Cromwell and Sam Green. And I had kind of just word vomited, for lack of a better word, everything that I was feeling surrounding kneeling and Black Lives Matter as a movement in general, and how I felt as, you know, a young Black woman in the sport, and how I felt as a young Black woman growing up. And I, you know, immediately we had a back and forth and very open discussion and started brainstorming ways in which we could integrate my kneeling, not only, you know, as my personal show of activism or my personal show of solidarity, but the ways in which my team could then integrate into what I wanted to do. And so the next day we had a conversation after practice with the whole team. My coach sat him down and was like, listen, you're going to listen to Kaia right now. And, you know, at this point I was only a sophomore. You know, I wasn't a captain. I was just somebody who had a really outspoken mentality and a loud voice. And I think that, you know, I wouldn't have felt comfortable enough at the time and where I was at. You know, I was still a teenager, trying to confront these larger systemic issues. I don't think that I would have felt comfortable enough, you know, speaking out necessarily without the overwhelming support from my coach and from my assistant coach and my head coach. They both made it very clear to me that, you know, it wasn't going to affect my playing time. It wasn't going to affect anything. And I think the difference was that they understood where I was coming from as a human being and as a person and as a Black woman. And they cared about my well-being off the field just as much as they cared about it on the field. And I think it was that allowed them to then, you know, embrace what I was trying to do. And, you know, they were also aligned politically with me, which I think helped. LA is generally a more left-leaning area. So, and I knew that going into UCLA too, which is one of the reasons that I picked it. Both my parents were student athletes there as well. It's where they met. So UCLA was just sort of a natural fit for me. But I honestly was surprised that the administrators were so supportive. The day before, or not the day before, the first game day that I was deciding to kneel, it was like mid-season. Our sports supervisor came into our locker room and gave us a talk before the kneel and was basically just like, we are so proud of what you guys are doing. We're here to support you in any way that we can. Just know that you have our full support behind you. Which again, I know and I could recognize is a very, very unique experience. And to be honest, I was quite surprised when that happened. But, you know, throughout the entire rest of my career, as I kneeled, I felt supported in the fact that there was no backlash for my actions. And, you know, at the time, that was what I needed. And I can look back and see, you know, there are definitely areas where I feel I could have been more supported, maybe with access to trauma-informed mental health, more specific mentors for Black student athletes, you know, more education on, you know, how what I was doing was going to affect me in the long term. But again, for the time that it was, I think it was a very powerful show of solidarity. And I really think that is what set me on my current path. And so I'm just grateful that I had that support. And I know that that is a very, very, very unique experience in the college sports space.
Yeah, I think you're right, Kaia. That is incredibly unique. And I think I'm grateful, at least to the folks at UCLA, for the support that they provided you. And I think with that said, maybe you could talk for a little bit about, based on your experience, what would you recommend other institutions do if they want to support and amplify athletes' voices?
Yeah, I think that they need to put policies in place that specifically eliminates fears of retribution. Again, the reason why I felt comfortable speaking out was because I knew that there weren't going to be consequences for it. And I feel like having policies in place that make that specifically clear for athletes of color, especially who, whose livelihoods lie on them competing in this sport, and oftentimes the livelihood of their family. Um, I think that would make it a lot easier for athletes to participate in activism. I know that, in a lot of ways, I feel like athletes are sort of dropping the ball in what they're doing with their own personal activism, but I also recognize the structures that are in place that make it very, very difficult to do that. And so I think specific policies that eliminate threats of retribution, getting cut from programs, cutting your scholarship, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think putting in place robust mental health services for athletes of color is a major stepping point, because as I've learned in doing my activism, racial justice work is super exhausting. It's spiritually draining, emotionally draining, mentally draining, physically draining. There are times when I cry just because the overwhelming hurt that my community is feeling. And I feel like a lot of colleges and institutions don't have the correct structures in place to properly do that. I know now I have a Black woman therapist who I don't have to explain the extra levels of racism to. I don't have to explain what a microaggression is, and I don't have to deal with re-traumatizing myself on top of trying to heal my trauma. And I didn't have the option of having a Black woman to be my therapist while I was in college. And it actually made me recoil from the idea of going to therapy, not having somebody that looked like me to talk to. So I think those are two very tangible ways that institutions can sort of address these issues, but I know that there's a lot more, and we're just at the precipice of beginning to implement them.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful, Kaia. I think I'm going to ask one more question for the entire group. And I think this question came from our Q&A, and I think it's a really good one. And so at the start, we listed a dozen or so policy and practice recommendations from the Drake group. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, each talk about what recommendation or initiative you think should be prioritized. And I will put my Drake group colleague, Emmett Gill, on the hot seat first. Emmett, I think you're still muted. There you go.
I said I wanted to make sure that I was looking at all 12 of them. I think number 7 is a priority, which is the establishment of conference diversity, equity, inclusion task forces to address racism and prejudice behavior. But based on what we said, I would sort of expand that. In the aftermath of George Floyd, we saw a lot of athletic departments starting DEI work. And I think I can say with confidence that as we move into 2022, that movement is almost, I won't say it's stopped, but it's slowed down drastically. And so I think some conference level initiatives need to continue to be put into place in such places like the Big Ten. I think the Pac-12 is doing an outstanding job. But Bruce, equally as important, what I would add to that is that I think we need to institutionalize Black student athlete associations. We have them at UCLA, have them at the University of Virginia. I think that not only would provide our college athletes with more of an avenue to speak out, but I also think that it's going to provide them with the coverage and the safety that we need. You know, in the aftermath of George Floyd, we saw a national organization be developed in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion in college sports, national. We saw the Black ADs come together, but yet the momentum of these groups is sort of slowed down. So my answer to that question would be number 7. We need to institutionalize DEI efforts at the conference level, but also develop a national organization to support Black Student Athlete Association.
I would add to that, Emmett, that a lot of that needs to be disconnected from the athletic department. I think that's a really, really important caveat. JD, what are your thoughts?
So first of all, I credit the Drake group because all of these are, I think action needs to be taken in all regards. I'd say it probably wouldn't surprise anybody here to hear me say that I think that 3 is really important. That's the one that reads adoption of institutional hiring policies that maximize the number of minority candidates in applicant finalist pool. So I think that'd be for coaching and administrative positions. So that's certainly very important to me. But I will add, particularly having spent this last hour speaking with Kaia, that I think number 10 is also critical. Call for institutions to fully support the rights of athletes to freely express their concerns about racism. I'm just, as I listen to her speak, I'm thinking about how I would feel as, I guess, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old in a nation where, you see people who are taking a knee, getting very vocal in public, threats of all sorts and all social media and coming down from all levels of government and everything else. To be able to take that knee, it's just to me, it's just tremendous courage. I have massive respect, but it shouldn't have been so difficult for her. And then she had all the support she described. And so if there can be an institutionalization such that doing what Kaia did at all schools is, I'm not going to say as easy as it was at UCLA, but is assisted, is supported in the way that it was at UCLA, I think that you'd have a much more expressive student athlete community of color, and ultimately a more cohesive one. And ultimately, because the positions that are being articulated are necessary for us to grow as a society, we as a society will benefit from it. So I'll even subjugate my number 3 to number 10. I think number 10 is maybe the most important.
Thank you, Jeremy and Kaia.
Yeah, I think, this is a great list. I think they're all very, very important. I think, in my experience, maybe it's my youth, I don't know, but I'm very disillusioned with the idea that institutions are going to do the right thing without some sort of legal repercussion or legal consequence. And so I very much think that number 12 is an urgent issue in addressing the issue of the racial exploitation of college athletes, just because I think without consequences, these institutions have no desire to make any sorts of changes. If this model has been working for them and has been making them billions upon billions of dollars on the backs of Black and brown athletes, why would they change? And so I think creating some sort of legal consequence for addressing these issues is going to be a really big step in moving the athletes' rights movement forward. And, I'll even go beyond just this. And I fully support the unionization of college athletes. It is a full-time job. It is employment, even if the NCAA wants to create the idea of amateurism to try and hide that. So, I think that even beyond just guaranteeing NIL and health and medical protection and that sort of reform, I think that, college athletes should be able to unionize. And I know that there is support in Congress for it. I've talked to senators about it. So I think that's going to be the next, historic step in fixing this system of college sports, is allowing athletes to unionize. So.
Yeah, I think that unionization discussion deserves its own 90 minutes, and maybe we could all get back together again sometime in the future to talk about that. I do agree with you, Kaia, that congressional action, I think, is extremely important. And like I said at the start, there are lots of folks like me out there who get into the system to try to transform the system, and it's impossible to do it on an individual basis. I think institutions have demonstrated an unwillingness to make changes, because why would they? They're making bunches of money off of it. Things are going real well for them. I also agree with what Jeremy said earlier, though. The system, there are signs that the system is beginning to crumble. So change is afoot for sure. We've come toward the end of our time now, and I want to offer each of our three panelists 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to offer a final word. We'll go Emmett, then Kaia, then Jeremy.
I never had an opportunity to bat lead off in college, so this is a pleasure for me. What I want to go back to is our theme here, exploitation. And I don't want us to forget about name, image, and likeness. Because right now, while it is going to benefit numerous college athletes, I'm not so positive about the impact that it's going to have for our Black and brown college athletes. I'm concerned on a couple of levels. You know, I have forecasted that I believe that NIL is going to be most beneficial to the student athletes in the non-revenue sports, as well as our white female student athletes. Some people can disagree with me, that's fine. But my other concern is the next couple of years with regard to how the NCAA and the government intervenes in NIL and begins to further shape what athletes can and cannot do. And I wonder how restrictive that is going to be to the NIL opportunities for Black and brown college athletes compared to their counterparts. And so when we talk about exploitation, you know, how much ground will Black and brown college athletes really gain when we talk about their participation in the NIL marketplace?
Thanks, Emmett. Kaia.
Yeah, I would say, you know, some of the most powerful voices in creating change in this world have been athletes. Some of my most admired heroes were athletes. And so I think, you know, there really is the opportunity to create real change using the voices of athletes. And so now it's on all of us to create systems that allow those voices to be heard. Even in just, you know, my few years of being an activist, quote unquote, I've been able to create change across the world. And if one voice can do that, imagine the power of athletes being empowered with, you know, protections and with the full confidence of people behind them. So, you know, I really believe in the power of the athlete activists, and I think it's our job to allow them to flourish.
Thank you so much, Kaia. And Jeremy, please.
You know, I think I would finish where I began, which is that we all love college sports. And if you're someone who loves college sports, just think about the fact that there are costs, and those costs are disproportionately borne generally by people of color. And if that's something that's not okay with you, then engage in trying to change it.
I think you're absolutely right, Jeremy. And I would finish with that, something similar. Action is where we're at right now. There's opportunities for each of us as educators, as athletes, as health practitioners, faculty, to do something, to participate in some kind of action that will bring about some change and some transformation to a system that I think we all can admit, as uncomfortable as it might be to do so, exploits particular athletes. So I want to thank my three colleagues for participating today. Thank you, Emmett. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Kaia, for coming today. I also want to send out a word of appreciation to the Drake Group for creating and developing a space for us to share our ideas, our thoughts, our opinions as well. And I'm going to thank everyone for listening to us today and offering some really interesting questions and thoughts as well. I look forward to doing this again. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.